Hello and welcome to the European Report. This is the first edition of 2013 here in the European Parliament, here in the heart of Europe. Today's topic of discussions is one. Firstly, we're going to discuss is the controversial new Holocaust Museum that's opened up here in Belgium that's caused controversy. And the other issues we're going to face is the issue of the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Syria and the dangers that chemical or biological weapons could fall into the hands of dangerous Islamist organisations that could use these against Israel and threaten European security. The final issue we'll be discussing is the issue of Iran and how, after Israel's recent war against Hamas in Gaza, how the Iranian regime is continuing to fund and rearm Hamas. And I'll be asking what are the implications for this for the ongoing Middle East peace process. I'm joined in today's programme by Henry Bioski, who is the Vice President of the CCOJB and the founder of Judaica, and a friend to the European Report, Thomas Sandel, and MEP Hannu Takkula, representing the Central Party and also representing the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. So, gentlemen, welcome to the European Report. Firstly, I'll start off with you, Henry. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background, what you do, and how here you're representing the Jewish community here in Belgium?
First of all, I think that I can start with the very beginning. 32 years ago, I started and I founded the first Jewish radio in Europe, Radio Judaica, and I think with this I start really the so-called career. You don't have to exaggerate. I'm also the vice president of the CCOJB, as you mentioned, which is the equivalent of the Board of Deputies of Belgian Jewry.
Excellent. And Hannu, can you tell us, welcome to the European Report. It's a great pleasure to have you on the programme. I know that you're a strong advocate for Israel. How did you get involved in politics and become a member of the European Parliament, and why is Israel important to you?
So thank you. I think it's quite a long story, but put it that short. First I studied the music. I was a young music student in Tampere. It was 1982. And then Ulla Järvilehto, she was a member of our national parliament, Finnish parliament at that time. And she organized one event and she invited me. I sang there in that event and it was Israel event. She was there and then then Steve Lytle was the other speaker. And I have to say that that was some kind of turning point. That, you know, even though that I was a younger musician, I was quite interested in the politics also. And then in that meeting, you know, something happened and I decided that in some way I would like to do something for Israel. And it was 1982. And of course I didn't have any idea what it's going to be. And then I studied the music, but then I found out that I'm not talented enough. And then I went to university. I started to study education in Lapland. And then 1995, the Finnish Centre Party asked me that if I can be the candidate in the elections, and you know, they thought about it that I don't have any chance to be elected. But anyway, so that was that kind of moment for me that then I thought about it. Okay, I would like to run for the parliament, and the Israel issue comes to my heart. That if I'm succeed, then of course I'm the Lapis and Finnish representative, but mainly the Lapis representative in our national parliament. But also the Israel issue is very important for me, and I would like to do what I can do in that field. And then some kind of miracle happened in 1995. I got in our national parliament, and then I was 10 years in our national parliament, and then 2004 I joined the European Parliament. And the whole time I have to say that the Israel issue has been very important for me. So of course I grew up the Christian family, and my father was the friend of Israel. So that was that kind of background that when I was a little boy I already get to know something about Israel and Jewish people. So of course that was the main thing. But you know, in the personal way I met or faced that issue in 1982 when this MP Ulla Järvilehto organized that event, and I have to say that in that event they said that that the Soviet Union is going to collapse. And we have to be ready to help the people, the Jewish people, that they can go back to home, Israel. And then I thought about it, that's not the real real thing, that it's not, the Soviet Union is not going to collapse. But anyway, I said to my wife that if something like that going to happen, I would like to take part of this process. I would like to take part and help the people in Aliyah, and that was the first step, then, as I said, then in 1995, when Center Party asked me to be the candidate, I said yes, even though that it shows that I don't have any chance, but.
Excellent. So 7 years it will happen then, from 1982 to 89, it will begin to happen.
Yeah.
And Thomas, I want to bring you in because very grateful for your continual ECI support for the European report and the programme. So it wouldn't happen without you. So much thanks to you. But also, can you share some of the activities that the European Coalition has been involved in recent weeks, certainly since our last episode back in December?
Well, thank you, Simon. It's always good to be back. And of course, I have to be honest and say it has been Christmas and New Year, and we have been enjoying this holiday. And I believe, just like Hanno, when you have a very intense year ahead of you, it's so important that we can also have time to relax and reflect. But nevertheless, one thing that I would like to mention. That is that we have been more and more active in the national capitals of the EU member states. Let me give you one example. In December, before Christmas, we went to Paris. And France, of course, being the country in Europe which has the largest Jewish community. And I must say that I was almost surprised by their concern about the situation in France. But also what they said was that we feel quite isolated, we feel alone. We don't see anyone, apart from the Jewish organization, really trying to make a difference. So they were really asking and pleading, with the European Coalition for Israel, please could you do something in France? And I'm happy to announce that we have started activities in Paris, in France, and this will be followed up in other capitals throughout the European Union. We have a similar development also in Stockholm, in Sweden, a country which has been faced with new forms of anti-Semitism in the last few years. And personally, I will be visiting London in a few weeks' time and coming back again in March. So we are looking at finding ways of being more active also in London. And I know compared to France, there are many good organizations in Britain, but I believe that if we can work together, we can create an even stronger voice for Israel also in Britain.
It's definitely needed, that's for sure. And Henry, I just want to, the first topic we're going to discuss is the very controversial new Holocaust Museum that's opened up here in Belgium, not far from Brussels. Can you ask why it's caused controversy? Because there's a discussion in the title that's called the Museum of the Holocaust and Human Rights. And there's a lot of critics are saying with this new museum that it doesn't completely focus on the Shoah, but focusing on other human rights abuses, and therefore waters down really the horrors of what happened on this continent 70 years ago.
Well, the answer is in your question. The problem was immediately this title. All over the world, I didn't visit all the museums, but I think it's not a mistaken that all the museums are called Museums of the Shoah or Holocaust, but not and something else. Here, the Flemish government was financing this new museum, asked it to be called Museum of the Shoah and Human Rights. Well, generally human rights is a word that don't disturb anybody, but if Shoah is not the main issue where these human rights were totally killed, then what else? So we are astonished by adding these words, human rights. But honestly, I think that we cannot make a trial before evidence. Of course, the first speeches, the first reactions were very controversial, that's right. Let's monitor this case because we are afraid, to be honest. Jewish community here is very afraid about this because Where is it starting? With the Shoah. That's, of course, very normal. But where is it going to end? That's the question today. But I would like to be not only waiting for the future months or future years. We are afraid. I repeat it, we are very afraid, because with human rights you can start with everything, but you can finish with a lot of other things. We are afraid really about it, but we are going to wait, because the vice president of this museum, Claude-Marie Nover, is a very, very tough leader of the Jewish community in Antwerp. He is really looking to avoid any problem, and we trust him, of course, about this. For the rest, really, we are going to be very, very careful, and he will be very careful, I think. But let's say that this title is not the best one that have been chosen.
Yeah. And Thomas, I want to bring you into this discussion, primarily because, you know, the horrors of the Holocaust, in which over 6 million precious Jewish lives were murdered at the hands of Nazis, it still casts a dark shadow over the Jewish community across Europe. It also, Europe has a great deal of responsibility and also guilt for the Holocaust and allowing this to take place. Thankfully, we've had lots of memorials services across Europe and repentance across various countries and parliaments for their actions within the Holocaust. But doesn't the danger with this museum, that it's entitled the Holocaust Museum and human rights, and also focuses on collective violence, that this is just political correctness gone mad? And isn't there a great danger we lose the message of the Holocaust and really appease some of that European guilt, rather than focus on the true horrors of the Nazi regime?
Well, again, just like my colleague Henri, I can't comment on the Belgian case. I haven't visited a museum. I can only comment on what I have read, but maybe I should just look at it from a more general point of view. And yes, it is true that there is a danger that Holocaust becomes just another genocide. I think this should not be misunderstood. Of course, we need to take action. We need to bring about educational tools to prevent any genocide, any mass murder, racism, xenophobia, in any ways and forms. But I believe it's so important to keep the uniqueness of the Shoah. And when I say the uniqueness, I often mention this example. How is it that there's only, to my knowledge, only one ethnic group throughout the centuries, going back in our culture to the Book of Esther, which has consistently been threatened with annihilation? Racism, of course it's a problem. Genocide, of course it's a problem. But very rarely do you see these diseases be repeated on and on again. To give an example, the Armenian genocide. Of course, it's a grave violation in any way you look at it. But if you look at history before the Armenian genocide, if you look at history today, you cannot say that there are any threats to the Armenian people today. Why is it that looking through the thousands of years back, but still today, you hear the same language as Haman in the Book of Esther. You hear the same language as Hitler on the streets of Europe today. This is a problem, and it's a unique problem. And if we lose sight of this uniqueness, we run the risk of trivializing the Shoah. And this is something which we see, generally speaking, from the United Nations to the European Union. In order to gain consensus for our fight against anti-Semitism, it will always have to be combined with something else. And yes, this is a matter of concern.
And Hanno, how important is it that we educate young people about what happened on this continent 70 years ago, to remember the Holocaust and to really teach about the dangers of anti-Semitism in our schools?
I think it's extremely important, and I think that it has to be the compulsory part of the all European Union member states' school curriculum. I know that, for example, in Sweden, they started that kind of process when Göran Persson was the prime minister, and they made a special book and they delivered that for every school, and I think that was the young student, 14, 15 years old, which went through this book, and so I think that something like that we need in whole Europe, and we have some European-wide education programs funded by the European Union, like lifelong learning program, and then Europe for Citizen program. The Europe for Citizen program, there's special remembrance section also. So I think that through them we can do that, and it's very important to do, because as Thomas already mentioned it, that nowadays when you walk in the streets in all around Europe, you can hear the voice, that kind of voices, what you heard about 70 years ago, and anti-Semitism is growing, and then racism is growing, and xenophobia. So we really need something, and I do believe that education is the way, and how we can reach the people, and that's the best and most effective way to do that. So it's extremely important.
Yeah, Thomas?
I think it's important also to look at the demographics, that it's one thing if you are 75, 80 years old and you may have personal memories of the Second World War, or at least your parents would have been involved. When you look at the demographics today, you say someone who is 15 or who's even 20, he may not even have been born in Europe, his parents may not have been born in Europe, which means that their exposure to the Shoah is non-existent. And this is where the real danger is today, that you have people in this age group with no exposure, with no knowledge, and which was the case in Sweden. They did a survey where a very large percentage of young people say that they were not sure that the Shoah had happened. They didn't say that they denied it flatly, but they were not certain that the Shoah actually did happen. And that's when Prime Minister Göran Persson took this wonderful initiative to inform the whole Swedish young population.
That's excellent. We need more leaders like him, that's for sure, across Europe. And Henry, in the course of researching this programme, I was shocked to discover that the new Holocaust Museum was opened recently by King Albert, the Belgian king, with the government of Belgium, opposite the Dozen barracks in Michelin, the site where 25,000 Jews and 352 gypsies were deported to the Nazi death camps between 1942 and 1944. How was this allowed to happen and be built on this site?
It was not only allowed, it was asked. Since years and years, we thought in the Jewish community that like Jacques Chirac did it, like François Hollande did it before in France, that the king himself, after a few mayors of Brussels, Liège, Antwerp, spoke about the responsibility of Belgium's administration during World War II, that the King of Belgium should speak, and he spoke. And we are really grateful. The Prime Minister, the Prime Minister, Elio Di Rupo, spoke too in Malines, Mechelen, as you want, and he recognized this responsibility of the administration, the Belgian administration, in the deportation of the Jews of Belgium. Also, we obtained, directly after the speech of the King and the speech of the Prime Minister, that the Senate, the Belgian Senate, will now go further, because we asked too in the Jewish community to go further, to establish who was responsible. And this is very important, so we are really grateful, because honestly, we wait for a long time, but okay, let's be positive and estimate that this year was a very important year, because during 2012, these mayors spoke, the Prime Minister spoke, and the King spoke. So we are now expecting the results of the work of the Senate. Of course, in Belgium, this discussion is always very difficult, because, as you know, it's not the same feeling in the Dutch part of the country than in the French-speaking part of the country, and in the Belgian common situation it's always very difficult, but we hope really that it will be a solution about this, and not to fall again in the traditionally Belgian discussion between Dutch-speaking people and French-speaking people, because as our friends mentioned, it's very important. We knew since years and years that when the direct witnesses of the Holocaust will disappear, and unfortunately it's coming with the time, somebody said we will have only called historians speaking about Auschwitz, like we can speak today about Verdun or other terrible war episodes. So voilà, we are in this situation, but what was declared by the King, the Prime Minister, and a lot of mayors in Belgium during 2012 is going in the good direction to avoid, of course, this confusion, forgetting the Shoah, and we expect now that 2013 will be the year of the work of the Senate to go further and to finish this work of memory of the state of Belgium.
That's very good. And I want to bring you into this one. Thomas, I had the privilege now of interviewing 5 survivors of the Holocaust or the Shoah, and heard their personal stories firsthand and researched the interviews. And one thing that comes across more important is it's so important to keep these memories alive, to honour those who perished at the hands of the Nazis in the most cruel, horrendous death. What is ECI doing in terms of honouring those that were murdered during the Holocaust for Holocaust Memorial Day, which is on Sunday, the 27th of January this month?
Yeah. Let me first say that in 2005, European Coalition for Israel initiated and organized, together with member of European Parliament Hanna Takkula, the first International Holocaust Remembrance Day event in this Parliament, in the European Parliament. This event has since grown and become an official European Parliament commemoration, which will, on the 22nd of January, be held again, hosted by the now current President Martin Schulz. What will happen in this Parliament then is that a particular auditorium will be dedicated to the humanitarian Swedish diplomat and businessman Raoul Wallenberg, which will in a way also give a mark to Holocaust remembrance in the heart of this building, which I believe is significant. We have, as a coalition, called upon faith communities, churches, to honor the victims of the Holocaust on the Sunday nearest to the 27th every year. This year we are cooperating with an artist from New Zealand who has put together a remarkable and very unique exhibition with interviews from Holocaust survivors. And we will make this exhibition available on our website so that I think we agreed that every third day there would be a new film or a new story told by a person. And there's nothing which can, just as you were saying, there's nothing which is so genuine and real as having a person who was actually there to explain in his own words what happened. And the fact is, of course, that we have millions of stories which are all unique. But the sad part is, of course, that we have 6 million stories which are never told. They are forgotten. And this is the least we can do in Europe and beyond to honor those 6 million victims. But I believe, again, that it's significant that it's happening here in the European Parliament. But I would encourage everyone who is watching this program to go to our website, www.ec4i.org, and go to the exhibition and spend a few moments on the 27th remembering these victims. And if you are part of a local church, make sure that this is incorporated in the church program so that you can together commemorate and pray that it will never happen again.
Yeah. And Hanno, how important is it that for the Holocaust Memorial Day service here in the European Parliament that all members of the European Parliament attend to honour those victims of the Holocaust, but also to remember what happened here on this continent 70 years ago, and also to make a stand against the growing rise of anti-Semitism here in Europe?
I think it's very important, and many times we have that kind of saying that politicians, they have very short memory, you know, about 2-3 months, and as Thomas Sandel mentioned it, I remembered 8 years ago, European Coalition for Israel, Thomas and I, we organized the first Holocaust Memorial Day here in the European Parliament. And if I remember right, there were 3-4 Parliament members and then the staff altogether about 20. And last year it was, I think, more than 500 altogether. You know, it's growing very fast. And I have to say that when we started, I think that we didn't understand that it's one day it's going to be so big event here. And I have to say that that's one of the best things during that time, this 8 years when I have been here in the Parliament, what has done. And now it seems to me that members of the Parliament are more aware for that event and even what happened in Europe. And of course, that's very good that at least once a year we commemorate. But of course, it's important to organize the different kind of seminars here and try to be active in that field because we know that unfortunately at the moment in Europe the racist and anti-Semitism, that kind of voices is growing, and we have to do something. And of course, it's also, how can I say, bad sign that here in the European Parliament we have some members who deny the Holocaust, and you know, as you may know, I don't mention their names, but anyway, I mean that here is someone's, and of course the awareness is very important. And it seems to me that when we talk about the Middle East issue, for example, there are a lot of that kind of Parliament members who really don't know what is the history of the Middle East. They really don't know what was the Ottoman Empire. They don't know what was the Balfour Declaration or what was the San Remo Conference. And I have been in that kind of seminar that some people, some politicians said in that way that there were the Palestinian state and then the Israelis come and occupied that. You know, something what is totally against all the history, but it shows me that we need a lot of knowledge about the history, because at the moment, in some regions, there are many MEPs and many people who really don't know what is the history, what really happened 60, 70, 80 years ago, and that's one very important target for us to try to organize that kind of seminars and try to increase the knowledge among the MEPs, and that's what the European Coalition for Israel do.
Excellent. Yeah. I know you want to come into
Yes,
this point, Henry.
this is very important what was said now. I think that the fact that this year maybe the red line border was really broken for the first time in 2012, maybe 2011, but okay, that's not the problem. In France, in other countries, things were said, things were made against Jews that we didn't see from the Second World War on. And in a lot of countries it happens, in Belgium, in France, in Hungary. Look what happens in the parliament in Hungary. In Greece, we have so-called, I don't know why, neo-Nazis, official parties. I think what happens is first, as I said, for the first time, so many anti-Semitic attitudes, but for the first time maybe non-Jews are more and more thinking and understanding that attacks, anti-Semitism, are not concerning anymore only Jews, but are also non-Jews. I was, during a lot of years, a member of ministerial staffs. I was chief of staff of ministerial cabinets, and that was really my thinking about this, about France. Really, a lot of political responsibles thought that anti-Semitism is a problem only for Jews, unfortunately, but only for Jews. I think that what is going to happen, and maybe it explains that you pass from 5 to 500 members of the parliament here meeting. I think that non-Jews, and that's maybe the hope that non-Jews, politicians, but people in the streets, journalists, understand now that anti-Semitism is today a problem for the whole civilization and for all the peoples, and not only for the Jews once again.
Absolutely, I can completely agree. Also, Henry, I also want to say, how do you feel about the rise of anti-Semitism here in Europe? And we've heard that Israel's ambassador to Denmark and the head of the Copenhagen's Jewish community has warned the Jewish community not to wear anything that visibly marks them out as being Jewish, in fear that they will be physically and violently attacked. Now, isn't that pretty shameful to actually happen here in Europe?
Well, it's a very important question. I think that the first explanation for this situation is what I said before. The red line we tried to build since the end of World War II was broken. Since 1 year, 2 years, doesn't matter. I think that today too, maybe people understand also, as I said, this is concerning not only Jews, but the whole society, but also that anti-Zionism or anti-Israel is not now considered, understood as the same than anti-Semitism. During years and years, we had this situation where people said, okay, people criticizing, and that's the right of everybody, first in Israel, people are criticizing their government and very sharp, so that's not the problem to criticize Israel or the government of Israel. But now people understand more and more they don't like that. Now, people don't like that, but now they are faced with the reality. This hate towards Israel and Israelis is really a question of anti-Semitism. And now in Belgium, for instance, and I speak about what I know the best, is my country, it's clear that the importation of the conflict of the Middle East is one major explanation of what happens here in the streets, like in Paris, like in Brussels. And now we have to work with the politicians, with the journalists. We have to work very hard and very quick about this situation. We must ask our medias, we must ask our politicians to do everything, even, I speak as a lawyer, on legal aspects, police aspects. We have to mention that to impeach that this criticism of Israel is becoming anti-Semitism and allowed, saying, okay, they have the right to criticize Israel. Of course, everybody has the right to criticize Israel. But then we understand when we check what happens in the streets, we see the words utilized, they are anti-Semitic words and not anti-Israel. And what's said before, and I will end with this, a lot of these people criticizing Israel, they don't know anything about the Middle East, and more than about Israel or Middle East, they don't know anything about the Palestinians. When you speak, you go in the streets during a rally and you speak with young Arabs here in my country, in Belgium, you said, okay, I understand you are defending the interests of the Palestinian people. Why, how? The conversation is finishing there, because unfortunately, they don't know anything about this general conflict of the Middle East, even about the Palestinians they are fighting for or supposed to fighting for against Israeli, that means against Jews in Belgium or in France.
Yeah. The next subject we are going to discuss is the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Syria, particularly now. There's a great fear that the stockpile of chemical and biological weapons held by the regime could fall into the hands of dangerous Islamist groups in Syria. Hannu, how concerned is the European Union about the situation in Syria, concerning that there are real dangers now that Assad's chemical and biological weapons could fall into the hands of dangerous Islamists, organisations that are fighting alongside the rebels in the civil war in Syria?
Of course, European Parliament is very concerned and worried about what happened there, but it seems to me that at the moment, the European Union and the Parliament, they don't know what to do. They don't have that kind of tools to do. Just resolutions and communiques, but it's not work, you know. And of course, it seems that it's more this discussion in the United Nations, and the big problem is at the moment that some countries like Russia, it's not in the same line with some others, like the European Union and the United States. So that's a big big problem. But it seems to me that the European Union really would like to do something, but we don't find the way, or Union is not find the way how to go there. Our High Representative, Lady Ashton, she gave and she going to will give the speeches concerning the situation and so on, but it seems that there's no influence at the moment, and of course it's a big question mark. What is the right way to do? What's the right way to act? And of course, when the European Union is not a military power, we don't have that kind of tool that we can make some intervention. So we can just try to find the way how we can continue continue discussions, or how maybe we can put both parties in the one table and start the negotiations. But at the moment, only what I can say that it seems to me that we don't have that kind of tools. So only resolutions, and it seems that it's not helped.
And Thomas, isn't there a great danger that the situation in Syria could escalate, certainly by involving the neighbours of Syria, particularly Israel, and that if Israeli intelligence confirm that dangerous chemical and biological weapons could fall into groups like Al-Qaeda, elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, other Salafist terrorist-linked organisations, even Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, then Israel may have to go to war in order to protect her citizens. Yeah. And we could see a new war in the Middle East.
Absolutely, and I recall that the Prime Minister recently spoke about this danger. I basically see three different scenarios, as you rightly mentioned. Scenario that either Hezbollah or the different jihadist groups in Syria would get the stockpile of Assad or biological or chemical weapons. And this, of course, would again be a game changer in the whole region. But I also see, and this is possibly my greatest concern, that Syria would try to provoke Israel into the conflict. And we know too well from recent history how even when Arab people are fighting, between themselves, that what seems to unite the region more than anything else is to be able to blame everything on Israel. So there are those who see a scenario where Assad would, at the last option he would have, people say, would either be to use chemical weapons against Israel or to draw Israel directly into the conflict, because this way it could again change the dynamics. And I think this is something that all of us have to take into consideration, and I think that Catherine Ashton and the United Nations and the European Union should be aware of this possibility, and they should make very clear guidelines already now to say that what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. But yes, the threat towards Israel is not only Iran, it's increasingly from the north, from Syria and from Lebanon.
And Henry, we've heard news this week that the UN are very concerned about the ongoing civil war taking place in Syria is actually beginning to spill over onto Israel's Golan Heights, which is the border between Israel and Syria. And so the UN are thinking of pulling out their UN peacekeeping forces that have been there since the 1973 Yom Kippur War and have been successful in keeping the ceasefire between Israel and Syria. Isn't there a great danger if the UN pull out, this will just allow a greater escalation of the conflict and could lead to a future war between Israel and Syria?
You're right, and as Thomas said now, I think there's a danger for everybody in this region, because this region is starting in Iran, then Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and with the new so-called New Egypt, it's a very surrounding dangerous situation, not only for Israel, for the UN, and for all other countries in this region. So we know that Russia is forbidding for the moment a solution. We saw the last declaration of President Assad. We saw the last declaration of Mr. Putin. So I don't have big hope about the evolution of the situation. There's a danger to try to involve Israel, of course, through the Golan Heights or through other actions, of course. But we must be very careful about this line starting in Tehran and ending in Cairo, because nobody knows what it's going to become. And the question is why other countries do not act like they act, for instance, or they want to act in Libya. I think that a lot of countries, democratic countries, are afraid about what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt. So maybe psychologically, not objectively, but psychologically, they are maybe afraid to do more against Syria because they think, and I think it's right, they think that if, it's terrible to say that, if Mr. Assad will finish his career, and we hope so, what will happen after him? Worse? I think yes. So that's maybe the reason which impeach politicians to do more, because everybody understands what happens there. Everybody knows that what they did in Libya could be done in Syria, of course. I think this is the explanation. You can agree with it, you cannot agree with it, but I think that is the explanation of this weak reaction of people that understands what happened in Syria. So the danger is very big. The question is always, since the very beginning, till where Mr. Assad can go without a reaction from the NATO or from any other countries. Now, the new President of the United States, who is the old one, Mr. Obama, France is trying to work. We don't know what Mr. Hollande is thinking about this situation. I think really the problem is there. Are they going to do what was so easy to do in Libya or not? I think that we must be very careful about it, and the democracies must be very careful. But I can understand that it's very difficult to estimate in this region. It's so difficult to estimate what can happen with people like Mr. Assad. It's very difficult.
Yeah. And Thomas, I really want to bring you into this one as well. It's my impression that the European Union is more concerned about stopping Jewish homes being built, trying to boycott and label Israeli produce produced in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, than actually about confronting the real dangers that are posed in the Middle East by dangerous Islamist groups that have either come to power in the Middle East through the Arab Spring or on the verge of power.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I think if I could give advice to the European Parliament, I think the first step would have to be you have to identify who are your friends, and how do you find a friend? A friend is usually someone who shares your values. It shouldn't be rocket science in the Middle East to look country to country and say, well, which countries in this region are sharing the basic fundamental values of the European Union? The dilemma which we have is today that the European Union, Western community, seems to be more concerned about Israel and acts of Israel being wise or not wise, as building homes, extending a home, than they are to the overall threat to the whole region. We saw the latest reports from the United Nations, 60,000 killed in the civil war so far. You don't see people going out on the streets anywhere in Europe. You don't see people writing letters to the editors. You don't see people being overly concerned. But once Netanyahu, and again I said wisely or not wisely, not for me to say, decides to build a number of homes in historical Jerusalem, this is what makes European leaders, including Catherine Ashton, come out and become aggressive and say, well, this is a real threat to peace in the Middle East. I'm sorry, but as a layperson, given my education in international law and political science, I cannot quite follow. And I think this is where there has to be a radical shift in thinking. So we don't end up in a situation where we are today, where we don't really have any good options in a situation like Syria. It's perhaps going from bad to worse. And here I expect more leadership of the European Union and by the United States.
And Hannu, also, what was your opinion? Does Baroness Ashton and the EU commissioners really understand the dangers and the threat of a destabilised Middle East and how this poses a direct threat to European security?
I hope that they understand, and I think that they are very, they have a lot of information and what is the situation there. But of course, as Thomas said, it seems to me also that during the last 3-4 months here in the European Parliament, for example, we have had the discussion much more concerning the Israel or West Bank or Gaza than the Syria. And for example, boycott against the goods from the West Bank, it has been the big subject here. And you know, it seems to me that, as I already said, that in Syria issue, we don't have the tools what to do. And you know, then it's easier to speak about Israel and blame to Israel and so on. So, of course, as a member of the Parliament, it seems to me that the European Union is a little bit loose the understanding what is the European Union. The European Union is a union of the values, democracy, human rights, freedom of express, and then rule of law principles. And I think that that's what we have to do in the Middle East also, to promote the democracy, promote human rights. But it seems that we are not able to do that at the moment, you know, and for example, in the Syria case, we are more or less, we surrender, you know, that we say that we don't know what to do. But of course, I hope that they are informed. But of course, one other issue is also that there are some political views, and in the old days, and it seems to me that even nowadays, some left politicians, some socialists, they have some sympathy for the Arab countries, and it seems to me that even though that that kind of things, what they can't accept happen there, they try to understand, and they try to understand then, and there's some kind of sympathy. And in some reasons, Israel is that what it's easy to blame, and even though that Israel shares the same values what we have in the European Union.
Gentlemen, down to I believe the last 5 minutes of the programme, and this programme slide by. So we're on our final issue really, so it's maybe just a couple of minutes, less than a couple of minutes each on this one. And this issue that we're going to discuss now is the growing menace of Iran. Now that Israel's had a recent conflict with Hamas in Gaza after an escalation of rockets and missiles have been rained down upon southern Israel, which has paralysed over 1 million Israelis from going to schools, going to hospitals, going to the work. We now find the Iranian regime is refunding Hamas. Isn't it important, if Europe wants to play a major role in the Middle East, then they have to find ways to actually prevent Iran from smuggling and giving weapons to rearm Hamas, but also more dangerously Hezbollah in the southern Lebanon. Henry, over to you.
Well, the problem is what Hannu said just before I speak. There's always one way to criticize and to see what happens in Israel, and one way to see or not to see, or not willing to see what happens not far from Israel. And the case about Gaza is exactly the good example. We heard, we saw false pictures. And for the first time, thanks to internet, we saw that when they tried to put on the net pictures, false pictures about, for instance, unfortunately, a child killed by Israeli army, it was in 5 minutes after it was shown on internet that this was what was false, because it was a child from Syria, killed by the Syrian army. A few times they tried with these pictures like before, but before it was successful because nobody destroyed the system. This time, internet destroyed. I think this is very interesting. This time, the so-called bad pictures about Israeli action, it doesn't function because people on internet was working and showing what was the real picture. Very important. So maybe they will not try it next time. I think really, in this case of Gaza, we see, because there are not enough dead people, it's terrible to say that, enough dead people in Israel, they say, okay, let's see what happens in Gaza. And you have words, we spoke about Holocaust, the words concentration camps. In French, we listen always to this sentence, prison, camp de concentration à ciel ouvert, prison à ciel ouvert. It's terrible, you know. And when you tell people, look, go on, once again, on internet and look what happens in Gaza, really, what happens in Gaza. How is Gaza living with the Hamas? Nobody wants to check it. But when one soldier is doing something bad, wow, it's terrible. So we are always in this double point of view. I think now it's impossible to say that they don't see the difference.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they go on with this difference. And that's maybe the work of the politicians, European politicians, mainly because it's here in Europe that we have this situation more and more, always criticizing Israel, never criticizing Arab countries.
And Thomas, I just want to bring you in very, very quickly here. I've got to ask you the question, are economic sanctions that the European Union are spearheading actually working? If we continue to see that Iran is on the brink of developing nuclear weapons, they're rearming Hamas and their continued support for Hezbollah with rockets that are capable of reaching Tel Aviv pose a major, major threat?
Well, I have to be short. So short answer is no. But I would like to come back and let this be my final comment to say that the whole situation is what I would call a battle of ideas. And you mentioned the internet, images, pictures, concepts. And this is why the war today is different than what it was in the past. And I always take this example. Holocaust didn't happen because Hitler woke up one morning and said he's going to kill all the Jews. It was a long, long process, and it started with words, it started with ideas, and that's why we need to get involved on this level. And this is what we're doing through European Coalition for Israel. This is what Hanno Takkula is doing in the European Parliament, and everyone can do something. So I wouldn't want to leave you with the illusion that nothing can be done. Many good things can be done and have been achieved.
Yeah, and right, we've come almost to the end of the programme, so I want to thank you very much, Hanno, and it's so very important that our Christian viewers get behind you to pray for you and support you, because you're making a real stand on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people. And Henry, I think it's important as Christians here that we acknowledge the great contribution that the Jewish community has made through the centuries, and that's why we're going to stand with you and fight with you to fight against anti-Semitism and tell the truth about Israel and the truth about the Middle East. And I want to thank you all for watching today's Middle East report here from the European Parliament in the heart of Europe.